Hello orchid friends, welcome back to my channel. Wherever you are, I hope you're having a great day, staying healthy and staying safe. Today we're looking at one of my water culture orchids. This orchid is a no ID from a grocery store. I've had this orchid for about 3 years, and each year it has rebloomed since my initial purchase, so it's a very reliable bloomer, I would say. Water culture is a fun method, and I have used this method on quite a few of my orchids, but since my initial fascination with water culture, I have sort of graduated onto other methods, and right now in my collection I only have 4 or maybe 5, I need to check, 4 or 5 orchids that are still in water culture method. And the reason I say water culture and not full water culture or semi-water culture is because I've noticed that it's best to go between these two methods and adjust according to what you see and according to your environment. And I can probably elaborate a little bit more later in the video on how I do it. But let's come back to this orchid. Primarily, I give this orchid anywhere between 1/4 cup to 1/8 of a cup of water each watering cycle. And in my environment, I like to water my orchids once a week, so I try to give all my orchids a set amount of water that's enough to allow a wet-dry cycle within a week. So for this orchid, for the amount of roots, based on my observation and trial and error, I discovered that anywhere between 1/4 cup and 1/8 of a cup is enough water to hydrate this orchid, but then allow that wet-dry cycle to complete within a week. Typically on the 5th and 6th day, it's almost dry, and the 7th day is definitely bone dry, and that's when I give this orchid another round of watering. And of course, the water that I give to my orchids already has fertilizer in it. I use quarter strength fertilizer because I'm a firm believer that you should fertilize weekly. So instead of introducing a high concentration of fertilizer, you reduce the concentration and you can give it to your orchids more frequently. That's what I do. This orchid is not fragrant, but it's pretty hardy because initially it did not have that great of a root system, but just based on the root thickness and the way that it grew at the time, I think it was going to be a hardy orchid. So I decided to use water culture method to try it out on this orchid. And of course, at that time, I was still trying to learn about what I can do with this growing method. So it's safer for me to use a grocery store Phalaenopsis orchid to test things out. And it turned out well because it has always rebloom every year. So that's what I like about this orchid, because it's helped me learn quite a bit about how to look at the orchid and really know what it needs. So water culture has a lot of advantages. I think from the get-go, for beginners, for novices, you get to see the roots, and you can see if the root is rotting in water or if it's just not growing. You can adjust accordingly. So that's the biggest benefit. And the second biggest benefit is that it does not have medium, so you won't have the possibility of having any bugs. Yes, you may have some, small things here and there, but primarily I think it's a lot easier to have bugs or pests in mediums like moss or bark chips. And then another, I think, advantage is that because it's growing in water, or you have more water in the container, so it's less likely that the water culture orchid would be dehydrated. It's usually having too much water that's causing water culture orchid issues versus dehydration. And as far as container goes, planter goes, Personally, I use plastic cups because they're readily available, cheap, and they don't break if you drop them on the floor. I know a lot of people use glass containers for their water culture orchids, which I believe they look beautiful. I personally just don't like to use glass material because you may break them. And because I use outer cup to reduce sunlight to avoid algae formation, so if I choose to use glassware for water culture orchids, that also means if I cannot find proper container as outer container to block the sunlight, I'll have to deal with algae on the glass, and I may have to clean the container more often than I want to. Another thing about water culture that I have found over the years is that it actually is a fun method, but it does not necessarily means it will save you time. It is not a method that you can set it and forget it, that kind of thing. It's not sci-fi. It's definitely not that, because you do have to look at the relationship and the growing condition of the roots, especially the roots that are submerged in water, the portion that's even just touching the water, not necessarily completely in the water. You have to observe it, because sometimes you may have to reduce the amount of water you provide to your orchids, and sometimes you may have to dump out the water completely, depending on what you see. For example, if you're seeing the root is definitely rotting, are you still gonna dunk it in water? Definitely not. You will have to dump out the water and just let that orchid sit for a few days so that it's completely dry. And once it's completely dry, you get to see which roots are definitely dead. You just trim them away and then slowly, gradually introduce water back to the container. And if you're just about to convert new orchids to water culture method, you do have to know that sometimes existing old orchid roots may potentially not have the ability to quickly adapt to the water culture method, and it will continue to rot until your orchid produce new roots, which is more used to the water culture method to be able to continue to thrive. So initially, your orchid may look like it's going downhill and it's rotting all its roots and it's not doing well until new roots emerge, and then this orchid is then able to properly hydrate. So it's possible. For most of my water culture orchids, I think I'm lucky because most of them adjust to the water culture method quickly. So I haven't had that kind of experience where the orchid is like dying and then bounce back from water culture. From the initial conversion anyway. So I hope this helps you understand the pros and cons of water culture. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!